My husband did not ask for a divorce. He slid the papers across our kitchen table like the decision had already been made. My sister stood behind him, smiling, while he told me to take the children and leave. I packed one bag without begging. Years later, she appeared at my door holding the same kind of folder. What had he done to her that night? The first sound I remember was not my husband's voice. It was the scrape of a manila folder sliding across our kitchen table. He said he did not love me anymore. Then he said he loved my sister. He wanted me and the children out that night. For a moment, I could not move. The refrigerator hummed behind me. His signature was already on the papers. Mine was not. Yellow tabs marked where he expected me to sign. He spoke as though everything had been decided, even though all he had was a proposal from his lawyer. Then the front door opened. My sister walked in and stood behind him. She looked relieved. A small smile rested on her face. She said this was not how they wanted me to find out. They were not sorry for what they had done. They were sorry they had lost control of the moment when I learned the truth. She set her purse on the counter. Her keys struck the granite. Among them was a brass key shaped like the spare key to our front door. The affair had not merely entered my marriage. It had been given a key to my home. I closed the folder and pushed it back. I told him I was not signing anything that night. Upstairs, I packed the children's medicine, our identification, clothes, my daughter's stuffed rabbit, and my son's dinosaur pajamas. I opened the joint account on my phone, photographed the balance, and sent it to my private email. When I woke the children, I said we were sleeping somewhere else. My son hugged his backpack. My daughter held my hand and looked back at her father. He did not step toward them. I walked past him and my sister without another word. Silence can look like surrender to people who mistake noise for strength. That night, my silence was the first decision I made without asking either of them for permission. I drove until the lights of a 24-hour diner appeared under the neon sign. I parked and finally let myself cry. My daughter waited until my breathing slowed. Then she asked if Auntie was going to live with Dad now. I looked at her in the rearview mirror and understood that the children had noticed more than we believed. I told her I did not know what their plans were, but none of this was because of her or her brother. After they settled, I emailed the bank image again and called my closest friend. I did not know how I would rebuild our lives. I only knew I would not let the two people who betrayed me decide what was left of them. Years later, the woman who smiled behind him would stand at my front door holding a folder of her own. By then, she would understand that my husband had never written a new love story for her. He had only reused the ending he gave me. To understand why I ignored so many warnings, you have to understand who I believed those two people were before that folder ever touched my kitchen table. Before that night, I believed my husband was the safest person I had ever known. We met at a friend's engagement dinner in a small Italian restaurant. I knew only the couple getting married and planned to leave early. Then he sat beside me and told a story about getting lost. By the time our drinks arrived, I was laughing. When a server spilled water, he stood up and helped move the glasses. Later, he remembered that I hated olives and traded plates with me. Those details seemed small. That was why they mattered. The hardest people to recognize are not always the ones who lie badly. Sometimes they spend years being exactly who you needed, until being that person no longer benefits them. Not every good memory was false. Some moments were real. But a sincere beginning does not excuse a dishonest ending. We married in my parents' backyard because we wanted to save for a house. My sister was my maid of honor. She helped me choose my dress, fixed my veil when the wind caught it, and gave a speech that made my father wipe his eyes. She said she had never seen two people fit together so naturally. She hoped she would find a love like ours someday. Afterward, I squeezed her hand and felt lucky twice over. I believed I had a devoted husband and a loyal sister. When our children came, our home became louder in the best ways. On Sunday mornings, my husband made animal-shaped pancakes. Most looked nothing like what our daughter requested, but she laughed every time. He built block towers and called when work took him out of town. After our second child was born, we decided I would leave my marketing job for a few years. The childcare cost almost as much as I earned, and his travel schedule made 2 full-time jobs difficult. His salary could cover the bills. He told me we were a team. His paycheck was our paycheck. I believed him. I did not stop working when I left the office. I simply began doing work no one placed on a resume. I scheduled doctors, managed bills, remembered school forms, calmed nightmares, and kept 4 lives moving in the same direction. Then, one evening, he said he had to work late with his sales team. A few days later, I picked up his jacket for the cleaners. A restaurant receipt slipped from the pocket. 2 entrees, 1 bottle of wine, 1 shared dessert. The time matched the meeting he had described. The dessert was the one my sister always ordered. I held that receipt for nearly 5 minutes before I asked him about it. What frightened me most was not his answer. It was how quickly I wanted to believe it. I asked him about the receipt after the children were asleep. I kept my voice calm because I wanted an ordinary explanation. He said the dinner had been with a female client. The company would reimburse it, and there had been nothing worth mentioning. He smiled, touched my shoulder, and asked why I looked worried. A convincing lie does not always erase the facts. Sometimes it simply makes you feel ashamed for noticing them. 2 weeks later, my sister canceled lunch, claiming a work deadline. That night, she posted a picture from a rooftop bar where my husband had taken me for our anniversary. The glass behind her reflected a man's arm. I could not see his face. I only saw a metal watch like the one I had given my husband. I enlarged the picture until it blurred. Then I told myself, thousands of men owned watches like that. By morning, the post was gone. I had not saved it, and even my memory felt unreliable. The 3rd warning came at my father's birthday dinner. My sister arrived late and blamed traffic on the west side. My husband came in 20 minutes later and described another route. Both stories mentioned the same accident, although the roads were nowhere near each other. Both forks touched plates. The wall clock clicked. They avoided each other's eyes. My mother tightened her hand around her napkin. Families often call silence peace, when what they really mean is delay. We thought we were protecting a birthday dinner. In truth, we were protecting the people who were lying. After that night, my husband placed his phone face down and carried it into the bathroom. Business trips became more frequent. My sister stopped asking about my marriage, and her voice changed whenever his name came up. I asked my mother if she had noticed anything unusual. She hesitated, then said she had not wanted to accuse anyone without proof. I agreed because I was not ready to know the truth either. I used to think denial meant not seeing. Now I know, denial often means seeing everything and deciding you cannot yet afford what the truth will cost. The following Sunday, my husband came home early. He did not kiss me or ask whether the children had eaten. He only said that after they were asleep, we needed to talk. Then I noticed the manila folder on the chair beside him. By the time I tucked my son into bed, I knew whatever waited inside that folder had been prepared long before that evening. What I did not know was that my sister was already outside my front door. Before I tell you what happened when I went back downstairs, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is there. I always love seeing how far these stories travel and who is sharing this moment with me. When I came downstairs, the folder was no longer on the chair. It was waiting in the center of the kitchen table. A black pen rested beside it. Yellow tabs marked where he expected me to sign. The page about temporary use of the house was open, and his phone lay face down near his elbow. He said his attorney had reviewed everything. Signing that night would make things easier for everyone. Then he explained my future as if he were closing a sales deal. The children would adjust. I could stay with my parents or a friend. He would give me enough money to get started. Hiring my own lawyer, he added, would only waste money. That was when I understood how carefully he had planned my fear. The front door opened. My sister stepped inside using a key. She did not knock. She said they had never wanted things to turn ugly. I looked at the key and told her that if they wanted something clean, they should not have built it out of lies. My husband said he loved her and had not loved me for a long time. I asked how long he had been moving money. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then he said he had only been restructuring our finances for the separation. The word restructuring told me enough. People do not prepare joint finances for a separation they have not discussed unless they want the other person to begin with less. I closed the folder and pushed it back. I said my attorney would read it first. He reminded me that he wanted me out that night. I told him I was leaving because our children should not watch their family being dismantled at the kitchen table. He should not confuse that with surrendering my rights. Upstairs, I photographed the first page. I gathered the children's birth certificates, insurance cards, medicine, and clothes. I checked the joint account and emailed the balance to myself. Evidence does not need to be dramatic. Sometimes it is a timestamp, a bank balance, a photograph, or words someone believed you were too frightened to remember. My daughter asked if we were going on a trip. I told her we were going somewhere safe for the night. My son asked if Dad was coming too. I knelt, zipped his coat, and waited until I could trust my voice. At the diner, I bought 2 hot chocolates, fries, and coffee. I could not drink. My friend answered on the first ring. She told me to come over and not call him again. Morning, she said. Could be figured out when it arrived. I called the bank and asked how to protect a joint account without making a reckless transfer. While I waited, an old alert appeared in my inbox. A large transfer had been made weeks earlier. I did not recognize the destination. The affair had broken my marriage. The bank alert told me they had also been preparing to break my ability to leave it. At 9 the next morning, I sat across from a divorce attorney with the same folder in my lap. The first thing she told me changed how I saw everything that had happened the night before. I arrived at the attorney's office in yesterday's clothes. The folder sat on my lap beside the joint account balance, our expense list, and 2 hours of sleep. She read the papers, then told me that leaving for one night to protect my children did not erase my rights. From that point forward, I was not to sign, transfer, delete, or agree to anything without advice. Then she said the woman sitting there was not the woman my husband had expected to negotiate with. He had planned around the version of me he believed he understood. I had no income. I avoided conflict. He assumed shame would keep me quiet. That afternoon, I returned home with my closest friend. My husband was gone, but my sister had left signs behind. Makeup sat beside my sink, her coat hung over a chair. A coffee cup rested on the counter. Nothing makes betrayal feel more permanent than seeing another woman's belongings where your own life used to happen. I took my papers, work records, and clothes. I photographed only what my attorney said might matter. Within days, she requested bank statements, credit card records, investment accounts, travel expenses, and transfers made before the separation. My husband messaged that I was making everything harder than necessary. I did not answer directly from then on. Communication went through email and a co-parenting application. The records showed that nearly $32,000 had been moved. Some paid an apartment deposit and furniture. 2 weekend trips had been listed as client expenses. Another amount had gone into an account in my husband's name. The affair had wounded me. The money trail proved something colder. They had prepared my disadvantage before telling me the marriage was over. Because his job required frequent travel, the children would live primarily with me. We established weekends, scheduled calls, child support, and written notice for cancellations. Neither parent would use the children to carry messages. I did not keep them from their father. I also refused to place hatred in their ears. I wanted my children to learn the truth through patterns, not through poison from either parent. At our first mediation meeting, my husband became angry when the transfers were placed before him. He said he had earned most of the money. My attorney explained that income earned during a marriage did not become private property simply because one spouse received the paycheck. For the first time, he understood that he no longer controlled the conversation. The money was counted in the property division, though the divorce was not finished. Outside the office, he said I would come crawling back when I learned what life cost. I said nothing. I checked the personal account I had opened. The balance was small, but it was mine. He was right about one thing. I was about to learn what life cost. What he had not considered was how hard I was willing to work for one that belonged to me. 8 months later, I signed a lease on a 2-bedroom apartment. The rent took nearly everything I had, and the first winter there taught me that freedom can feel frightening before it begins to feel like freedom. 8 months later, I signed a lease on a 2-bedroom apartment near the children's school. The rent took nearly everything I had. A retired couple lived next door. On moving day, they left banana bread outside our door with a note that said, "Welcome home." Our furniture had not arrived, so the children slept on mattresses on the floor. My daughter asked if this was our real home. I told her it was ours as long as we took care of it and each other. That night, I lay between them and listened to cars outside. My husband no longer knew where I was. The privacy that once frightened me was beginning to feel like freedom. Then winter settled over Ohio, and the furnace stopped. The landlord could not send a repairman right away. I hung blankets over the doorway, dressed the children in layers, and moved both mattresses into one room. I called it Indoor Camping Week. We told stories with flashlights. After the children slept, I sat at the kitchen table with a calculator and added the rent, groceries, childcare, and my car repair. Children remember the fort made from blankets. Parents remember the calculator glowing after midnight. Around that time, I interviewed for a marketing position below the level I once held. The interviewer studied the 8-year gap on my resume and asked what I had been doing all that time. I answered without confidence and did not get the job. I cried in the car, then refused to treat one rejection as proof that my husband had been right about me. My closest friend helped me rewrite my resume. We included school fundraising, budgeting, scheduling, volunteer coordination, and conflict resolution. I had not been without skills. Employers simply did not know where to place them. At my next interview, the hiring manager asked what 8 years outside the workforce had taught me. I said it taught me to manage limited resources, solve problems early, negotiate with difficult people, and keep moving when someone else's failure left the responsibility in my hands. She offered me a 3-month contract with flexible hours. The pay was modest, but it could become permanent. The same day I received the offer, their father canceled a weekend camping trip. He said something had come up. My son had packed his flashlight and sleeping bag. I told him Dad could not come. He asked when his father could. The message gave no new date. So I took both children to a state park outside the city. We stayed one night in an old tent that leaned to one side. As I pushed the final stake into the ground, I understood that I did not have to wait for someone else to keep a promise before giving my children a good memory. My son still watched every car entering the campground. He had not stopped loving his father. He had only begun learning that love and reliability were not always the same thing. I was learning it too. The job would soon give me a future I had almost stopped imagining. But as my life became steadier, their father's promises became less dependable, and the children noticed before I was ready to admit it. At the campground, my son watched every set of headlights that turned through the gate. Each time, he lifted his head, but he never asked whether his father was coming. Children do not always announce when they lose faith in an adult. Sometimes they simply stop asking the question that has disappointed them too many times. Over the next few months, one visit became a short airport call. A soccer game was missed because a meeting ran late. So school program became something his father promised to watch later. Before my son's birthday, he asked whether his father was truly coming. I requested written confirmation. His father replied that he would arrive before the cake and had bought a baseball glove. My son placed an extra chair beside him. The guests arrived, the candles waited, the frosting softened. Every car made him turn toward the door. 40 minutes before the cake, a message appeared. The client emergency, stuck near the airport. Tell him I will make it up to him. After the guests left, my friend sent a screenshot from my sister's account. She was holding wine at a lakeside resort. My former husband sat behind her. The unopened glove box rested beside him. The caption said they needed a weekend away from all the drama. He had chosen a vacation over his son's birthday, then used work as a lie. I saved the post and his message. When my son asked whether his father had called, I said, "Not yet." After the children slept, I carried the empty chair away. Watching a child prepare a place for someone who has decided not to come is a different kind of cruelty. 1 week later, my former husband arrived 30 minutes late for the exchange. My sister waited in his car. I asked why he had not called his son. He claimed I had turned the birthday into a test. I kept my voice low. "You were not working." He glanced toward the car and understood. Then he raised his voice and said he had responsibilities outside my schedule. My son heard him. We looked at his father and said, "My birthday was on the calendar all year." No one answered. My sister lowered her eyes. My former husband accused me of turning the children against him and using written records to control him. I opened the record. 11 cancellations, 7 without replacement dates, 3 missed school events, 1 birthday covered by a lie. I told him documentation was not bitterness. It was what remained when promises stopped meaning anything. From then on, every change stayed in writing. I could not make him reliable, but I could stop building our children's lives around empty promises. If you are still listening, please comment below and tell me how satisfied you are so far. It lets me know there are still people walking beside me through this journey. Your presence is the greatest encouragement I have to keep telling the final part. My son's empty birthday chair showed me what inconsistency could take from a child. Not long afterward, I met a man who taught all 3 of us what it meant to keep showing up. After my son's birthday, I stopped arranging our lives around the possibility that his father might appear. I made one rule. If he confirmed and came, the children could enjoy the time. If he did not, our plans would continue. Stability did not mean preventing every disappointment. It meant making sure one person's disappointment could no longer collapse the entire day. My contract job demanded more than I expected. The software had changed, and some younger coworkers treated me like I was starting over. I balanced deadlines with school pickup, childcare, and the fear that one mistake would send me back to the beginning. Because of that fear, I accepted every task. My manager noticed. She told me competence did not require me to erase myself. I carried that sentence home. Soon after, she asked me to repair a local campaign that was missing its goals. I studied customer comments, removed what no one responded to, simplified the message, and kept the team on schedule. The results were solid. The campaign improved enough for the company to offer me a permanent position. No one applauded. Still, I sat in my car afterward and let myself smile. Around that time, I began seeing the same father at school pickup. He was raising his son alone after losing his wife. Our first real conversation happened when bad weather delayed dismissal. We stood near a coffee cart, holding drinks that tasted burned, and talked about forgotten lunches, math homework, and managing a household without anyone waiting in reserve. We did not exchange numbers. We simply kept meeting at pickup. One afternoon, my car would not start. He did not open the hood or take control. He asked whether I wanted help, or whether I would rather he wait with the children while I called someone. That question stayed with me. He offered support without turning it into authority. Over the next several months, he remembered my daughter's school performance. I helped his son prepare for a science fair. The children began sitting together while we waited, trading snacks and complaining about homework. After living with deception, kindness can feel suspicious. I kept waiting for consistency to reveal itself as a performance. It never did. After one long science fair, he suggested pizza because none of us had the energy to cook. While the children argued over the last piece of pepperoni, I realized I was laughing without watching the man across from me, for signs that the moment might change. It was not love yet. It was something I had forgotten could come first. Ease without fear. It took nearly a year before either of us called what we had a relationship. Trust came more slowly than affection, and for my children, that was exactly how it needed to happen. It took nearly a year before either of us called what we had a relationship. By then, the children knew him as the man who remembered pickup times and never made promises casually. Before we became serious, we agreed not to force the children to be close, ask them to use new titles, or move in together too soon. Disagreements about parenting would stay between the adults. Even with those rules, blending our families was not simple. His son and mine argued over video games. My daughter reacted when she heard him correct his own child. My son grew quiet when he attended one of his boys' games before attending his. Once, we disagreed about screen time. I heard old fear rising in my voice, the part of me that expected conflict to become abandonment. He did not leave. He did not punish me with silence. We took an hour, then returned to the conversation. He listened. I listened. We changed the rule together. A healthy relationship is not one without conflict. It is one where conflict does not threaten your right to remain safe, heard, and respected. My daughter tested that truth. After one disagreement, she asked whether he would still come to her recital. He told her a promise to her did not disappear because we had disagreed. On recital day, work delayed him. He arrived late, slipped into the last row, and stayed until the final bow. My daughter said little afterward. The next week, she handed him the date of her next performance. My own life was changing too. I began managing a small team, my income became steady, and I built an emergency fund one paycheck at a time. When my car needed repairs, I paid the bill without borrowing money or calling the man who once believed I could not survive without him. That felt like wealth to me. Years after our first coffee at school pickup, we married in a small backyard ceremony. String lights hung from the trees. My daughter chose wildflowers. All 3 children stood beside us without being asked to pretend the past had never happened. During the toasts, my son looked at my new husband and said, "You never asked me to call you Dad. You just kept showing up like one." Not long after the wedding, my mother called and said my former husband's marriage to my sister was in trouble. I said I did not need the details. Then, at a family dinner, I watched my sister flinch when his phone lit up. A second later, she apologized for overreacting. I knew that movement. I had made it myself. I had spent years wondering why my sister believed my former husband would become a different man for her. The answer came slowly. She had mistaken being chosen for being protected. At my father's retirement dinner, my sister arrived alone. She said her husband was meeting a client. Every few minutes, she checked her phone. When he finally walked in, nearly an hour late, she apologized before anyone asked. He placed his phone face down beside his plate and blamed traffic. My sister glanced at it, then said she was being too sensitive. I recognized the way her shoulders tightened and how quickly she made herself smaller. There is a posture people develop when they are being taught not to trust themselves. The shoulders tighten, the questions shrink, the apology arrives before anyone has accused them of anything. After dinner, my mother asked me to stay. She admitted she had noticed warning signs years earlier. She feared that speaking would destroy the relationship between her daughters. Then she said, "I thought silence would protect the family. It only protected the lie." I told her the relationship had already been broken. We had simply refused to name who was breaking it. Over the next few months, my mother shared what my sister allowed. My sister had left marketing to manage her husband's rental properties. She handled tenants, repairs, and schedules, but her name was missing from several accounts. She believed the work belonged to both of them because the marriage did. I had once believed the same thing. Karma was not a bolt of lightning. It was character repeating itself after the person benefiting from it stopped believing she could become its victim. My sister began finding the same signs I had once explained away. Late calls, trips missing from the calendar, money moved into a new account, a hotel receipt, one woman from his company appearing too often in his messages. When she confronted him, he did not deny it for long. He said he had been unhappy for years. He said he loved someone else. One night, my mother texted that there was an emergency. My sister was calling from our parents' house. The first thing she said was, "He slid a folder across the counter." I said nothing. She continued, "He said he loved someone else. He told me to leave." After a long silence, she asked whether he had used the same words with me. "Almost exactly," I said. I did not feel victorious. I felt tired. He had not loved one of us better. He had treated each of us according to what was most convenient. 1 week later, my sister asked to speak in person. I looked across my kitchen. My husband was clearing the table, while the children argued over a board game. I replied, "You may come tomorrow afternoon. Come alone." The next afternoon, I opened my front door and found my sister standing there with the same kind of manila folder that had once been pushed across my kitchen table. The next afternoon, I opened my front door and found my sister holding the same kind of manila folder that had once been pushed across my kitchen table. She looked thinner. She carried no suitcase and did not try to step inside. I did not invite her in. This was the home I had built after she helped drive me from the old one. Who crossed this doorway was my decision now. She said she knew she did not deserve the conversation. I told her to say what she had come to say. She admitted the affair had not been one reckless mistake. She had known I was suspicious. She had accepted a key to my house and used it while I was gone. She had walked through my kitchen and told herself my marriage was already over. Then she admitted she had smiled that night because she believed she had won. She said, "I thought he chose me because I was special. Now I understand he chose whatever was easiest for him at the time." She had confused being chosen with being respected. She had mistaken taking someone else's life for building one of her own. She said she missed the children. Then she asked if there was anything she could do. I told her to build a life that did not require someone else to lose theirs. She asked whether I could forgive her. I told her I believed she was sorry, but her regret did not restore her place in my life. I was no longer angry. I did not want her ruined. I did not need her pain to prove that I had survived. But I could not give her access to my children or the peace we had built. That trust did not return simply because the person who broke it finally understood the damage. Forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same decision. Forgiveness concerns what you choose to carry. Reconciliation concerns who you allow close enough to hurt you again. I told her I hoped she built something honest from there. She cried, but she did not argue. I stood quietly until she turned and walked away. After the door closed, I cried too. Not because I regretted my answer. I cried for the sister who once sat on a bridal shop floor and laughed with me. My husband found me in the living room and sat beside me until I was ready. Later, he said closing a door with compassion was not cruelty. Sometimes it was the clearest form of self-respect. That evening, I placed my old divorce folder in a storage box. The papers had once represented everything taken from me. Now they were records of a chapter that no longer controlled the rest of the book. For several weeks, I thought about that conversation more than I expected. Then one quiet family dinner showed me why I had made the right decision. A few months later, my father hosted a small retirement dinner at my parents' house. My mother called ahead to say my sister would not be there. She understood that peace sometimes begins with knowing who will not walk through the door. I arrived with my husband, my daughter, my son, and his boy. No one called us a blended family. We were simply a family. During dinner, my father raised his glass. He said he had never been prouder than he was watching what I built from the night I thought I had lost everything. My mother reached beneath the table and held my hand. She did not speak this time. Her silence was different. It was not protecting a lie. It was making room for the truth. My daughter talks about becoming a lawyer. She says she learned from watching me stay calm, keep records, and protect our home without becoming cruel. My son plays baseball on weekends. My husband stands near the fence, cheering too loudly and carrying the water bottles. His son calls my children his brother and sister without hesitation. I have steady work and money in an emergency account. Most Friday nights, all 5 of us sit around the kitchen table arguing over a board game. Our life is not perfect. Bills still arrive. The car still needs repairs. But the children feel safe. Promises are kept. No one has to wonder whether they will still be loved tomorrow. Sometimes I think about the woman I was in that diner parking lot, her hands locked around the steering wheel, certain that her life had ended. I wish I could tell her this. You were not watching your whole life end. You were watching the part that required you to disappear, finally lose its hold on you. For years, I thought winning would mean watching the people who hurt me suffer. I was wrong. Winning was building a life so peaceful that their regret no longer had the power to disturb it. Financial independence did not protect me from pain, it gave me choices. Family was not defined by blood or marriage papers, it was defined by the people who stayed, carried their share, and kept showing up when staying became difficult. Dignity mattered more than revenge. Were you satisfied with the way I handled my sister's apology? Or do you believe I should have given her one final chance? Tell me honestly in the comments. Would you have opened that door again?